first of all, I'm not a political scientist, so I cannot speak on this very important, very relevant topic of constitutional morality. But what I can speak on in a very perhaps brief and perhaps not very detailed way is about Ambedkar's effort to constitute morality, right? Or the constitution of morality that Ambedkar attempted through his thought, through his practice, through his life's work, right? And I just want to talk about what exactly this means for Ambedkar. What does it mean to be moral for Ambedkar? But before I begin talking about that, I just want to mention there's this very interesting, let's say, essay by this poet, literary critic called A.K. Ramanujan. And this essay is called "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" Right? And in that essay, Ramanujan actually tries to figure out what exactly marks the Indian way of thinking as a specific or a unique mode. Right? And he actually, in a certain way, begins by trying to distinguish between two modes of thinking. One which he calls context-free, and the other which he calls context-sensitive. And he says that the context-free is that you have these ideals or these universals or these standards which are free of any context, which can be picked up and placed anywhere, and one has to follow. And he says that the Indian way of thinking is not context-free predominantly, but it's context-sensitive. And I'll just give you a quote from his text, which is very important for us. Right. So he says, and this is a quote from his essay, "Such a pervasive emphasis on context, I think, relates to the Hindu concern with jati, the logic of classes, of genera and species, of which human jatis are only an instance. Various taxonomies of season, landscape, times, gun and qualities, taste, characters, emotions, essences are basic to the thought work of Hindu medicine and poetry. Each jati or class defines a context, a structure of relevance, a rule of permissible combination, a frame of reference, a meta-communication of what is and what can be done." So while Ramanujan himself does not remark upon this very, you can say, explicitly, it becomes clear to us that in his essay he is quite, you can say, implicitly pointing us towards the fact that the Indian way of thinking is one central, or one which you can say revolves around the concept of jati. One which revolves around, which we can perhaps translate as the concept of caste. And caste as this kind of context-sensitive mode of being, a context-sensitive mode of thinking. Now this exactly, and what it opposes to it, is the context-free mode of thinking. The one in which context does not matter. And I feel that perhaps this kind of juxtaposition which Ramanujan thinks of the context-sensitive as not just, you can say, marking out the Indian way of thinking, but also as perhaps the better way to be, the better way to follow. It is this context-sensitive mode of thinking that I feel Ambedkar's thought, in a certain sense, absolutely and radically challenges. But, and this is the kind of criticism that is opposed, that perhaps people like Ramanujan and others would, you can say, cast upon Ambedkar's thought, is Ambedkar's thought then just simply a context-free mode of thinking? Does he just take any of these standards that are universal in that sense and apply them to contexts that perhaps might not be amenable or might not fit to those standards? Right? And I feel that this kind of criticism which is applied to someone like Ambedkar is, in a certain sense, dangerous, but also not, you can say, correct. And this is because I feel, and this is maybe I'm not the only one who thinks so, that Ambedkar's morality, or the constitutional morality that he was, you can say, participating in, was the search for certain principles which would neither be context sensitive nor be context free. And those principles which we might call following the, you can say, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, we might call those principles a priori or transcendental principles. And it is this construction of these a priori and transcendental principles that one can find the, you can say, the third option between the context free and the context sensitive. And it is this, at least, which I feel is very important for all of us to think about. That when Ambedkar talks about, these three words that he borrows from the French Revolution, of course, liberty, equality and fraternity, right, are these principles which many have accused him of just taking wholesale from the motto of the French Revolution. Are these principles just borrowed from a certain European mode of being? Are they just copy-pasted, in that sense, plagiarized? Or is something else happening there? And I believe that, at least in the way that we should be reading it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, Ambedkar never said that. I'm saying many people accuse him of that. Many people definitely accuse him of just borrowing and copy-pasting it. But of course, he says he gets it from his reading of Buddhist texts and what Buddha's sayings were. But what I'm trying to say is that if we try to look at these three principles, instead of them just being something that exists in a box of other principles or values and he just picks them out, then the question would become, what is the principle of selection that would allow you to choose these three and not any other? Right. And it is this question which I feel is very important for students of Ambedkar's thought to at least attempt to answer. What we have to attempt to answer is why exactly are these three principles, not just any, or like not just three amongst many principles that he could have chosen, not just any principles that just existed and he just picked them out of a box as if randomly, but a priori transcendental principles. Principles that are required for any kind of political or social philosophy that Ambedkar is trying to construct. And it is this problem which I believe allows us to look at Ambedkar's, you can say, participation in the drafting of the constitution, participation in so many, you can say, protests and practices that would institute something like the rule of law within this country. Within a country where the rule of law was actually the rule of multiple laws, the rule of multiple, you can say, domains and multiple sovereignties. It is this, at least, which I feel is the very important aspect of Ambedkar's thought, that he is trying to institute something like a transcendental a priori set of principles. And it is this transcendental a priori set of principles which we can find at least encapsulated in these words fraternity, equality and liberty. Now, why exactly am I saying that these are transcendental principles? I am saying that they're transcendental principles in the very strict, you can say, Kantian sense, as the conditions of possibility of any kind of sociality at all. For any social form to exist. And this is Ambedkar's claim that he makes many times, you can say, against the anti-social nature of caste Hindu society. He claims multiple times that for any society to exist, for anything to be a society, there must be these three principles. These three principles of fraternity, unconditional equality, and unconditional liberty. These three principles are not just principles that you can say are constituted through the promulgation of a book of law like the Constitution. Rather, these three principles allow something like the Constitution to come into being. These three principles, at least for Ambedkar, in his, you can say, quest to find something that is opposed to the context sensitive. The context sensitive, which we might even call the dharmic ways of being. The dharmic ways of being in which you can say there is no universal standard, but only that which the people or the ones who follow dharma, the good men, the wise men, the sages, they are the standards by which one should live. It's something to oppose to this that is trying to discover these three principles as the foundational conditions of possibility of society. For Ambedkar, as we might remember in multiple occasions he says this, there is no such thing as Hindu society. Hindu society does not exist. And it must be brought into being, not Hindu society, but maybe Buddhist or Indian society must be brought into being. It does not exist. And for it to be brought into being, there must be certain principles, certain conditions that have to be at least held on to a priori. These conditions are therefore a priori in the sense that one cannot just pick and choose them. One cannot just reject them and say, oh, we can just get rid of fraternity, we can just get rid of equality, we can just get rid of liberty. Rather, these three principles come together as the fundamental conditions for anything like a society to be. And therefore, if they come together, and this is what I'm trying to think about, if they come together, then the question of morality, which Ambedkar, as a reader of, you can say, so many Western philosophers like Nietzsche, like Kant, was very aware that the question of morality is one that was, you can say, comes with its own baggage, comes with its own problems. Right? Which moral laws to follow, which moral, you can say, standards to adopt, which are the norms that one should, you can say, live by. And for Ambedkar, I feel that these three values, fraternity, equality, and liberty, these are not just one amongst multiple standards that one could choose from. Rather, these three are the only ones that would allow the possibility of something like a society to come into being. And therefore, a society which would, in a certain sense, you can say, have these a priori principles embedded within its very being. It is this kind of society that Ambedkar's constitution is built upon. The constitution, therefore, as many, as Professor Kumar has also pointed out, and we all find this in our, you can say, in the news almost all the time, there is a desire to change the constitution. There is a desire to at least say modify it, you can say transform it, to make it unrecognizable to what we think. And the argument goes, and this is the argument that they make, is that Parliament, in a certain sense, should have the power to change the Constitution. Parliament should have the power to make any kinds of consensual, or through consensual discussion, make those changes or effectuate those changes. How do we preserve something from the Constitution which would, not make that, you can say, make those changes ineffectual? And I feel for Ambedkar, the centralization of these three, you can say, values is something that allows, something that allows the constitutional or the constitutional morality to not be subject to this kind of changes. Because even these changes would require an a priori acceptance of these three principles as the most valid and legitimate principles. What I'm trying to say is that at least I find in Ambedkar, and if you read a lot of the ways in which Ambedkar talks about this question of morality, there is a centrality to this question of morality in Ambedkar. Right? And this centrality of the question of morality is, in a certain sense, opposed to his nihilism when it concerns Hindu caste society. His nihilistic attitude towards the immoral order that is caste social order. But this, you can say, the nihilism that is implicit in Ambedkar's work is not an absolute nihilism as it exists in someone like Nietzsche. The nihilism that is, you can say, implicit in Ambedkar's work is a qualified nihilism. It's a nihilism that tries to preserve certain transcendental conditions of possibility of sociality. And these three, which at least Ambedkar, where he says he borrows them from his reading of Buddha, some people say he borrows them from the French Revolution. I feel that even this question of borrowing becomes inconsequential here, when these three are at least considered by him to be the a priori conditions of any kind of social being. For us to exist in a society that is not structured by context-sensitive rules and therefore by caste rules, by rules that vary from region to region, from context to context. For us to exist in the kind of a society that would have this universal standard. These universal standards cannot just be arbitrary standards, but the standards that would allow for any society to come into being. And these three principles, which are enshrined in Ambedkar's constitution, enshrined in the way in which he wrote that constitution, are ones that cannot be abrogated, are ones that cannot be even changed in that sense. They are a priori. And this a priori nature of these principles is what I feel allows Ambedkar to, you can say, dodge this question of, you can say, the binary that Ramanujan draws between context-free and context-sensitive. And I think this is very important for us, because especially in, you can say, a contemporary discourse, universal standards and, you can say, monolithic standards are ones that are being contested day in and day out. We say, no, we do not really need these universal Western standards. We do not need these universal categories anymore. We must have our own specific, particular categories. And a lot of the work done in, you can say, decolonial theory has been trying to, you can say, contest the hegemonic universalism of Western modernity. However, Ambedkar's work allows us to sidestep this, you can say, this binary between indigeneity and Western modernity through this construction of this, you can say, this a priori conditions of possibility of society. And I feel this is one thing that we have to really hold on to when we try to think about what exactly Ambedkar's constitutional morality means. For me, it really means essentially it really means that Ambedkar is trying to constitute morality without it being something that is either context sensitive or context free. And I think that work which is carrying out, even though I feel that in a certain sense Ambedkar's thought remains a bit abstract in its kind of implementation, I think the work that is carried out is one that allows perhaps all of us, and maybe some of us here, to at least try to make those, you can say, a priori conditions, not just abstract conditions, but concrete ones. Right? And that is the work I feel that has been, you can say, bestowed upon us, or at least we have inherited. And as Professor Sukumar said, there is no time. So we have to really, in a certain sense, take this task not as one that can be deliberated upon, discussed, you can say, for days and months and years, but one that must be decided upon immediately. And I think we owe that to Ambedkar and his